So in this video today, I'm going to be going through how to prepare to write an essay on the Merchant of Venice, and in particular, how to structure or get a structure ready that is going to really help you work with any question that's given to you. You want something that's going to be like super simple, easy to understand, and has a very solid foundation in the terminology of the rubric, because of course that's obviously what markers want to see in your essay, as well as where the questions do generally derive their wording from. So one of the things I found is students really struggled or got a bit of a shock with the questions that were asked in last year's common module. So that was the 2019 exam. And the main reason I think people found that quite difficult was because they were asked for a specific theme, and it wasn't quite what people were generally expecting. Now, what I find is that if you want to have something that is going to work for any question, you need to prepare it a certain way. And that's obviously what I'm going to go through today, specifically for the Merchant of Venice. And that you've also practiced writing this material to as many questions as you can possibly get your hands on. And obviously that's work that you want to be doing throughout the year. So I just want to start with looking at, what, like how the Merchant of Venice links to the terminology of the rubric. And one of the things that I recommend doing is actually even having the rubric open and making notes even based on what I'm saying, so that you've got comments on the side of the rubric that just kind of show your understanding of how all these rubric points actually link to the text. I've actually done it in point form over here. And I will be sort of going through that as a precursor to looking at the kind of structure that you want to ideally use, or is just a recommended one. And the other thing I'm going to be using today is a copy of the Merchant of Venice through Google Books. So if you actually have a look at the version of that one, in case you would like to download it. Where is it? It's this one here. So, if you can see that particular title and get it from Google Books. I really like this one because I feel like the introduction of it is extremely good at having you understand, what was going on when this text was constructed, and how even the very writing of the text links really closely to the rubric. And what I've done here, and we'll be going through, is how will the rubric terminology come into play here. So if we have a look here, Merchant of Venice written, so on and so forth. I'm not going to read through all of it, just the main parts. But what they've said here is there is a deep ambivalence at the core of the play, which fuses together the fairy tale elements of a romantic comedy with disturbing questions of racial prejudice and anti-Semitism. So what you can see there is there's even a paradox in the way, in the actual composition of this text. You've got this kind of like romantic comedy of these lovers alongside this really sort of tale of prejudice, anti-Semitism, and obviously, like with the whole pound of flesh, it's very violent, and there's a lot of things that don't really fit into that romantic comedy sort of structure. So that in itself, you can see, is sort of raises kind of ideas of the paradox. So the form of the play represents the complex paradoxes inherent within the human experience and human condition. So that's kind of one thing. And then kind of coming here, the romantic love story comes to be intertwined with a dark narrative of hatred and revenge. So again, you've got that like paradox right there. Now, one of the key paradoxes that we see in this particular play is through Shylock. So during the time that this play was composed, there was a very deep anti-Semitic prejudice. So that's basically saying, there was prejudice against Jewish people. And it was a very sort of deeply Christian society. And so, of course, Judaism was considered at odds to the Christian values of the particular era. And so if you looked at other texts during the time that Shakespeare wrote this play, so there is another play called The Jew of Malta, and that's written by Marlowe. That particular one shows a villain who like has no humane qualities. Like there's no two sides to this character. He's just an evil guy and that's it. And that's a really common representation of evil or even good figures in more classical texts. So people would either be good or they'd be evil. There's no like multi-dimensional nature of human beings back then. And you can even see it in relation to things like law. So if you know, like, so say you even look at the 10 Commandments, you know, don't steal, don't lie, you know, it was very, very black and white. So that's an interesting thing to note because you know, now, like in the more modern era, when we think of things like stealing and lying, we'll also be like, oh, well, hold on a second, like, why did that person steal? Like if they were stealing medicine to treat their child because they couldn't afford it, well, maybe that's okay, you know. So there's a lot of kind of gray area. There's a lot of different dimensions we now have in relation to morality, which, you know, and other things which just wasn't present back in those particular times. So the fact that Shakespeare wrote this play about a particular figure, this Jewish man, Shylock, who has very human qualities. Like, don't get me wrong, he's, you know, definitely still represented as evil in you know, a large part of the actual play, but we start seeing these like human elements to him, you know, and we start even kind of sympathizing with him at particular points. And I'll go through that in a little bit more detail later. But, you know, the thing to kind of keep in mind is that, you know, Shakespeare himself, in creating such a different view of this villainous character, even that could be considered as an anomaly. So if you obviously are familiar with the rubric, that's the kind of word used in there. And so, you know, especially when he starts saying like, hath not a Jew eyes and hands, and, you know, he starts, and also the way that we see that they've, you know, spat on him, they've persecuted him their whole life. So of course, when then he starts not wanting to show mercy and wanting revenge, is he an inherently evil person, or is he just a product of the vilification he's experienced his whole life? And these are the kinds of questions that really start like bringing, like showing us that notion of like paradoxes and like inconsistencies in human motivations and behavior. So it's kind of like, you know, his, well, you know, like he's sort of, yeah, he's motivated by revenge and his actions kind of potentially start becoming quite violent, but then how did he get to be that way? You know, so again, like we get this kind of much more multi-dimensional, multi-layered view of the human condition. And so if you come back here, then it's possible to see him as both a victim and a villain. As indeed he has been viewed variously by critics ever since its inception 400 years ago. Traditional interpreters have tended to see him as an unsympathetic figure full of avarice and relentless cruelty. According to these critics, he is a merciless monster, full of greed and malice, who indeed well deserves to be crushed and subjugated. So you can see that that's really traditional. That's a very kind of old school interpretation. But then more modern views, so in marked contrast, recent critics tend to view Shylock as being more sinned against than sinning. They project him as a representative of an oppressed race. Suffering is the badge of his tribe. The inhuman treatment that he encounters as a Jew has robbed him of his humanity. So you can definitely see that really different view, such a paradox there with, you know, the fact that he's just a product of an oppressed race. His negative traits of cruelty and lust for revenge stem from his painful experiences of anti-Semitism. And then if you go on, they even make reference to the text. So Shylock's impassioned plea that Jews are a human being strongly evinces sympathy. I'm a Jew, hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, etc. So we know that one. And so that's kind of the first thing. Just want to clarify in terms of the, you know, sentiment of the era. I would recommend continuing to read through this. I'm not going to go into it again in too much detail, but the next kind of key idea is looking at, you know, the gender roles. So there is a very strong paradox we see emerge with the representation of Portia and even Jessica as well. Portia's probably the strongest, just because there's such a stark contrast between her being really obedient to her father and her father's wishes, but then her also you know, playing that role of a male, being considered a really esteemed lawyer, and sort of having that whole situation be resolved at the end. So that's another kind of thing that you can read a little bit about here. So that's where I just wanted to start, just as a sort of resource that I would highly recommend. In terms, and the other advantage of actually having an online copy is that I do have a couple of recommendations and quotes. And so the great thing with that is you can actually do a search. So I go, you know, hath not a Jew, and I want to find where that is, I can actually go straight to it. Or actually that's in the introduction, but it will come up further down here. Here we go. And that will just sort of help you navigate. Okay, I'm not sure where that went, but it does work in theory. Okay, all right, so back to here. So I've started giving like a pretty, you know, thorough introduction here, but there's a couple of sort of key sentences I've created that could really be sort of sample topic sentences, but of course you have to make sure that you do not prepare topic sentences. They have to be written completely for the question. But these are the sorts of ideas you could, you know, you could explore. So that's the one we talked about. The form of play represents the complex paradoxes which are inherent in the human experience. If you want to incorporate the words role of storytelling, because that's in the rubric, so through the role of storytelling, the play fuses together fairy tale elements of romantic comedy with disturbing questions of racial prejudice and anti-Semitism. So if they asked you about role of storytelling, obviously that's something you could say. Okay, and so yeah, you can sort of have a read through those. Again, Portia is an anomaly of her era as a woman. The play challenges society assumptions and ignites new ideas about a woman's capability and capacity to be savvy, a savvy business person and merchant. You know, the application, and then this is one I haven't really mentioned yet. So there is a real inconsistency in the application of religion and morality as the kind of cornerstone of religion, particularly when it comes to applying this concept of mercy, which is very prominent, particularly in the last act. So we have this situation where, you know, Shylock is able to take his pound of flesh, and everybody's just pleading with him not to, and he's like, oh, I'm not, you know, should I listen to any of you guys? They obviously upset at him, but feel like he's bound by the law, and then Portia finds her way out of it, and obviously her savvy. But then there's real questions about whether or not the, you know, that mercy that they were trying to preach to Shylock actually shown by the Christians at the end. So anyway, we'll come back to that. But that sort of gives you an idea of a couple of the key ideas that you could use that link really close to the actual rubric. So the application of morality consistent seen through the exploration final scene. Although aiming they're motivated by values, mercy, and forgiveness, the behavior of stripping Shylock of all his wealth and even his religion leaves us to question how merciful they have been towards him. This challenges Christian assumptions on morality and mercy. So as you can see, I've just, you know, put the words of the rubric in bold. And as I said, I would suggest you actually having a copy of the rubric and then making some annotations in your own words to sort of play around with the use of those particular rubric words and how you could approach those if you get asked those. And you do need to include them in your essay regardless of, or in addition to what the question's asking. Okay, I'm going to just, in the next video, I'm going to actually go through the essay structure in a little bit more detail, building on what we've already done.